Hi, Todd. Thank you so much for being here today. Before we get into the heavy subject matter of Jasper and the wildfires and what all went wrong back in July, I just want to take a moment to acknowledge that you're in your truck in rural Alberta right now and that this is possible because of Elon Musk's Starlink. You said that's how you're connecting to us today. For my viewers who watch my show consistently, you know that I'm a pretty big Elon Musk fan. So this is just so awesome to me that you're able to connect to us from your vehicle and have perfectly clear and very good internet, it seems, by all accounts. How often are you connecting out in remote places in your vehicle?
All the time, actually. Rural Alberta, the service with cell phones and everything is so intermittent that it's incredibly frustrating. A lot of wasted time when a person could be talking to people on the phone, and then as far as getting actually internet connection when you're in rural Alberta is always tough too. So this has been a really real game changer for me to be able to do this. And again, I use it for calling. I use it for interviews like this and everything. It's very helpful.
Yeah, that's awesome. I know you have a cabinet meeting a little bit later. So obviously, you really rely on this. My husband and I have had our fair share of difficulties trying to connect out in rural Alberta. I think there's even been instances where I thought I wasn't going to be able to get my show in just because I didn't have strong enough internet. So I think we're going to be looking into Starlink pretty soon here. You've sort of sealed the deal for me. So that's awesome. Okay, I want to talk to you specifically about this House of Commons committee meeting that was just sort of one of the biggest scandals that's unfolding right now. Obviously, Canadians were shocked and horrified during the Jasper wildfires. Jasper is such a historic village. It's near and dear to a lot of people's hearts, and it's just such a beautiful part of Canada. And when those firefighters were going, I know the premier initially said that up to half the village would burn, and now we know that 1/3 of the buildings burned. And, obviously it's reopened, people can go back, but there's so much that has been lost. And I think there's just a frustration among Canadians that pay attention to these issues and really feel like more could have been done. This House of Commons Parliamentary Committee meeting really brought those fears to roost, with Canadians hearing from a contract firefighter who said that he and his crew showed up to help the efforts in fighting the wildfires and were essentially given a very hard time by Parks Canada and told you're not allowed to be here. In some cases, they weren't even able to connect to water sources such as the Athabasca River. So I want to kind of dive into maybe what went wrong here. Let's start by playing this first initial clip. Here we can see a Conservative MP questioning this firefighter. His name is Chris Loewen. And Loewen is explaining that his crew, they're well trained and really all the resources that they came readily available with. Let's take a look at this first clip here.
We're able to muster enough vehicles to provide water yourself as a contingency. You don't necessarily rely on being able to tie into a hydrant. Is that correct?
That's correct. It's been my experience from previous fires that the hydrant systems cannot be deemed as reliable because they're only designed to have one or two structure fires at a time. So when you have numerous fire trucks tying in, it is not impossible for the water system to be completely depleted. So that's why we now use secondary water sources to supply water.
And you had the fire trucks and the water trucks available in order to engage the fire in Jasper in the town site, correct?
That's correct.
And you were told specifically that you could not access, and you were told specifically by Parks officials to not engage in fighting the fire in Jasper. Did I hear you say that correctly?
We were able to use water from Pyramid Lake, but not from the Athabasca River, and we were not allowed to engage the fire.
20 fire trucks, 50 firefighters, not allowed to engage the fire.
Okay, Todd, so there you really get a picture of what is going on. There was 20 fire trucks, 50 firefighters, and you hear Blaine Culkin sort of repeating that in disbelief, and a Conservative Alberta MP. Hearing those numbers, hearing that situation, what's your initial reaction to this information, Todd?
It's always frustrating when people are there to help, and just because of the processes involved with the federal government and Parks Canada, weren't able to. It's something we did battle in Alberta wildfire too, and we've been able to break down a lot of those barriers and make sure that there's that ability. We made sure that equipment you could be approved quicker and put to work a lot quicker than what was done in the past. But Parks Canada hasn't got that system in place. This is probably maybe somewhat a new experience for them, having a wildfire of this magnitude. When it comes to Alberta wildfire, we're dealing with hundreds of fires a year, and Parks Canada deals with tens of fires a year. So even though they do have good people working for them, they just don't have the experience that Alberta wildfire has.
So in this instance, this individual, Chris, he works for a company called Arctic Fire Safety. They ended up releasing a letter later on saying, a number of things broke down. They were essentially hired by resorts that were based in Jasper. And, the letter outlines a bunch of the issues that they had, that Parks Canada obstructed their activities, that they were told that they were not legally allowed to be there, that they were denied access to Athabasca River. So you're saying, it sounds like this was really Parks Canada first rodeo with something of this magnitude. Is that really the issue here, that they were just not prepared to deal with a wildfire of this magnitude?
Yeah, I think it's fair to say that they, I don't know any other time when a town in any of the national parks has burnt down like Jasper did. And but when it comes to these, these contractors coming in, like these hotels and these different places, they have contracts. Their insurance companies have contracts with some of these firefighting crews to make sure that they can protect their assets themselves. And I would have thought that there would have been free access to for these companies to go in. I know there was fire trucks going into Fort McMurray this spring when the fire was approaching Fort McMurray, and those were some contracted firefighting trucks that were headed in there, contracted by different companies, different hotels and things like that, to help battle the fire, to make sure that they could protect their own assets there. And so this is something that isn't uncommon, and so I was a little surprised that there wasn't a system in place for this.
So when you're saying that this is not entirely uncommon to have these contractors, if Alberta Wildfires had been the one responding to the fire in Jasper as they would in other parts of the province where it's not, a federally regulated a park, what would the response of Alberta Wildfires have been if contractors showed up at the door and said, "We're here to help"?
Yeah, so when it comes to Alberta wildfire, we fight the fire on the land base out in the forested area, forest protection area. And so the municipalities are the ones that are in charge of the wildfire when it comes into a municipality. So, for instance, Fort McMurray there, when that fire was threatening Fort McMurray earlier this spring, that was a municipality that would have made the decision on allowing those trucks to come in. And when it comes to Alberta wildfire, we're working mostly in the forested area and that interface area where where the fire is getting close to municipality. So we work directly with the municipality, but the municipality itself would have been making the decision on the entrance of those vehicles into the town site.
And have you ever heard of a situation like this before, where contractors showed up and the municipality said, actually, you guys aren't allowed to be here? And in that instance as well, in a case where it actually turns out that, for example, in Jasper, 1/3 of the buildings being burned, where a municipality turns away contractors and then ends up losing significant portions of the municipality that they are, supposed to be protecting.
Yeah, so there is situations that have happened in the past where municipalities have felt like they had the fire under control themselves and didn't want to have help from outside contractors, but that isn't the situation here. This is a different situation where we have a municipality that may have welcomed them, but Parks Canada being in control of the area there would have been a different situation than what we'd normally see in a municipality in Alberta.
Sure. I want to play one other clip from this interview where Loewen was saying a little bit, alluding to what he thinks might have broken down, or he talks specifically about the legislative process. He says there was no legislative process that allowed us to be there. Let's play this next clip.
You had said that you were not legally allowed to be there. Could you explain why you were not?
That's what was explained to us by the operations section chief, the second in command to the incident commander. As far as I know, we were allowed to be there because this was through the Parks Canada liaison person and our client that made these arrangements for us to be in there. I guess there's no legislative process to allow contract firefighters be in there on behalf of other parties. Must be the reasoning for that. But we did not show up there unanticipated. This was arrangements that were made on behalf of our client Pursuit and Parks Canada before we showed up. It's not like we show up at the door and managed to be let in like barbarians. It was our expectation that when we got to the gate that we were supposed to be permitted to go in to do our job to help protect the economic engine of Jasper.
So there you hear Christopher say, we had been working with Parks Canada, was our understanding that we'd be allowed in. He actually says we didn't show up at the door like barbarians demanding to be let in. I thought that was funny. And as
Yeah.
you mentioned, it seems like Parks Canada, they just didn't really have the systems in place. They weren't sure what to do with these volunteers when they arrived. For people like you and I who deal with the federal government on a semi-fairly regular basis, we are not surprised to see how this broke down. That seems to really be on par with the federal government these days. But when he specifically mentions that legislative process, I have to ask, is this something that is now on the government of Alberta's radar? And, is there any way they can compel changes within Parks Canada to ensure that in the future, when there's wildfires raging specifically near buildings, that contractors will be allowed in to help?
There's a lot of changes we'd like to see with Parks Canada and how they deal with wildfire. When it comes to municipalities, we passed Bill 21 in the legislature here this past spring, which allows us to be more involved in fires when they're in a municipality than we were previously allowed to. And we would like to see something similar to that for Jasper and Banff and the national parks. We'd like to be able to be involved. Again, we have the expertise, we have the equipment, we have the contractors and things like that can really do a great job in battling these fires. And when you have these major fires like this, the more expertise you have on the ground, the better. And I think it'd be advantageous to make sure that we were able to be involved like we can at the municipal level in Alberta.
Sure. That sort of brings me to something else I wanted to raise is after the wildfires happened, I know a number of people, especially on the conservative side, said, this was sort of an abysmal job from Parks Canada. Let's give this responsibility back to Alberta Wildfire. Let's have a provincial homegrown response to it. And you've said now that the Alberta government has produced changes. So are you going to be guaranteed now moving forward that if there is a fire in a federally regulated park, that Alberta Wildfires is going to be allowed in, or are those still changes that you're ironing out with Parks Canada?
The request has been made, and we'll see where that request goes. We've sent a letter to Minister Guilbeault asking to have that same sort of arrangement that we do have with municipalities in Alberta. So we've asked for that, and we want to be more involved in the fire prevention and mitigation efforts that Parks Canada has or hasn't undergone over the past several years. When we look at we have the Community Fire Guard program that we announced last fall that's being utilized right now and to help protect communities. We have Fire Smart, and we know some of the national parks have been involved in some of our Fire Smart activities. But when we look at what we've done with our forests in Alberta when it comes to pine beetle infestations and things like that, we are aggressive in fighting the pine beetle, but we're also aggressive in taking out those dead trees and taking out the trees that were in danger of being infested by a pine beetle. And that's made a huge difference as far as the fuel load in the rest of Alberta versus the fuel load in the national parks.
Todd, just my last question for you here. When we talk about sort of this breakdown in Parks Canada and their response to the contractors arriving, we've talked a little bit about how maybe it's not that surprising given how the federal government seems to be so heavily regulated in every avenue. And when something new happens, even if it's sort of a common sense approach, they just don't pick up on that. And because they don't have a process to deal with it, they sort of just reject it as they did with these contractors. I think for some people watching, there's such a level of fatigue with specifically this federal government and sort of the constant corruption scandals that we're seeing. And I can't help but think that some people watching this are going to feel like these contractors being turned away was maybe not just a government process breaking down, but perhaps something more untoward happening. What would your response to those Albertans and those Canadians be?
Well, I think when we look at the federal government is, they want to have control over everything they possibly can. And we know that they don't have the expertise and they don't have the on-the-ground knowledge that we have as Albertans. And I think other provinces probably feel the same way. And so it is frustrating to see this kind of control and these kind of decisions being made basically in Ottawa that it directly affects Albertans right here in Alberta. And again, I think there's a strong desire and justifiably to see that change and to see if we can get back to more local decision making.
Minister, thank you so much for your time today.
Thank you. I appreciate it too. And it's lots of good discussion. Lots of things need to be done moving forward on this.
Right. Well, we'll talk to you soon. Have a good one.